what makes show choir different from other kinds of arranging, I think it is helpful to jump in with just a quick overview of types of choral writing. So this is not arranging, this is music that's been specifically composed for voices, right? And the way I see it, you have three different categories. You have the traditional sort of choral writing, that's, your Bach, your Mozart, that's the stuff they teach you in music theory, and a lot of those rules are still important, the no parallel fifths and that kind of thing, right? But it's a different kind of music, obviously, than what we're talking about with show choir, because it's not in song form. We don't have the repeating chord structures and that sort of thing. So there's definitely some differences. Then you've got the contemporary choral writing, which I would consider to be a lot of what's written for universities today. It's the serious music, it's the art music, it's a lot of it is experimental, right? It's pushing boundaries, it's trying new things. And there's a lot of valuable tricks, I think, to be taken from that. But it's mostly polyphonic, and it doesn't really, you don't really dance to it, right? So there's some tricks you can kind of use for show choir arranging, but again, it's not quite what we're looking for. And the reason I bring that up is because these two first categories, they're what we're most often taught in schools, right? You go to university, you take a choral arranging class, you're going to be talking about how to write like Bach. You're going to be talking maybe about how to write something like an Eric Whitacre. Most of the time, we don't really ever get into how do you write arrangements of pop music, right? But I think it's worth pointing out that there are plenty of examples of original music that's being written in those sort of pop choral styles, as I call it, that we can use as a model. Stuff for Broadway, gospel choirs, theme parks, a cappella groups. There's all these different categories of music where it's based around songs, and it's meant to be recorded, or it's meant to be performed, or it's even meant to have choreography with it. And so we can use a lot of that as a model for our show choir writing. Okay, but I do think, show choir really is a different animal when it comes to how we write this stuff. The most obvious thing is that there's movement with show choir, right? You don't have to, when you're writing a Bach chorale, you don't really have to take into account what direction everyone is facing, or how fast they're going to be moving, or how tired they're going to be because they just finished with a dance break, right? So a lot of the, I guess a lot of this stuff is really practical that you kind of have to consider. But so there's movement. The biggest thing, I think, is just the show function. Whenever you write a show choir arrangement, you have to be thinking about, where does it fit into the big picture? Is it an opener? Is it a closer? Is it a costume change number? Whatever it happens to be. But if you're not constantly thinking of that and what the arrangement needs to do for that specific function, then you can run into some problems. Show choir arranging is different too, because obviously it's all song form, but there's also a lot of things with style that you have to consider. And again, depending on the show, like there's the emotion of the song, there's the storytelling aspect of the show. So there's all these sorts of other considerations to think about. And I bring that up just because, arranging a jazz piece for show choir is going to be different than arranging a rock piece for show choir versus a Broadway versus whatever the style is. So there's definitely similarities between all of it, of course, but it's not like there's one magic sort of formula for here's how you arrange every song ever for show choir. And then, of course, you've got to think about the practical considerations of just the performing space, right? Like a lot of times show choirs are performing in gyms, or maybe they're on a stage, but all they've got is hanging mics. And so there's not really any control over the sound. You've got screaming crowds that are going to be yelling and shouting and covering up all of the complicated vocal writing that you're doing, so I like to leave space in my arrangements after a solo, because I know that people are going to scream after a solo no matter what. And so you just leave a little bit of a buffer there before the next thing comes in, right? And we've all seen that. We've all seen you know, we've all seen audiences kind of trying to hush everyone up so you can hear the, you know, because they know the a cappella thing is coming next, right? And they want everybody to be quiet. So again, mostly practical things, but when we're writing show choir music, we're kind of doing it backwards, because typically we are making the arrangement, or the director is purchasing the arrangement, and then they're giving it to the choreographer to create something. And if you look at how you know, Broadway shows are workshopped, if you look at how those kinds of things are usually put together, a lot of the time, or dance is another great example, you know, dance recitals, dance studios, you'll have just sort of a dance accompaniment just sort of playing and making up stuff, and they'll do the choreography first, and then they'll send it to an orchestrator, you know, to put in all the hits and the swoops and the you know, they're writing the music to go with the visuals, whereas in show choir we're doing it backwards. So that means you've got to be thinking, as you're arranging, thinking about giving the choreographer opportunities, right? Giving them something to work with. So, you know, putting in hits in spots that make sense, making sure there's dance breaks, maybe a transition for a picture change, you know, thinking about the rhythms and making sure that those rhythms are something that's going to be danceable. You know, how you're using the band. Are you kind of hitting all of those you know, are you checking off all those boxes of style that we talked about, right? You know, so if it's a jazz piece, like, does it do what is the choreographer going to feel what they need to feel? Are they going to have the rhythm? Are they going to have the groove, in order to sort of not lead them, but for them to feel, we'll put it this way. You've got to put enough stuff in the arrangement so that they feel the same sort of energy that they would from like a true studio recording, right? So they want to feel all of those, you know, beats and percussion moves and filler things. I mean, you want to give them as much material as you can. Now, it's not all on you, of course. If you're working with a group or with a director, I would definitely ask for the video once you have choreography, you know, so you can kind of check things and make sure it's all working. Or you can, even better, you can talk with the choreographer in advance and kind of plan things out. You know, maybe you put notes in the music of where you want things to happen. You know, the classic example I always share is there was one time I wrote an arrangement for one of my, you know, when I was starting out one of my beginning groups, and I wrote this really awesome, like 6-part, you know, high, tall chord. And then I went and saw the show, and the choreographer literally had them like lying down on the ground, like on their side. And I was like, well, that's not going to work. Like, they're not going to be able to sing an A, like on their side, like flat on the ground. Like, it's not how it works. So, I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but you know, if it's a transition and vocalists are turning and some of them are facing back, you know, you're going to lose sound. And so there's definitely some visual things you have to consider with that. Also, the rhythms of a song. I mean, this is something I personally feel like it's better to change rhythms and make them simpler a lot of the time, because, you know, doing these like complex syncopated 16th note things while at the same time you're moving to a different beat, I mean, it's not always effective. I get pushback on that sometimes. A lot of directors and choreographers really want those original rhythms. You just kind of have to get a feel for the group and what the song is. But, you know, if you don't want things to be hard unnecessarily. You don't want things to be hard just because they were hard in the original, right? And so if making a syncopated rhythm, if you're turning that into straight 8th notes and then that's going to make them sound better, then great, do it, you know? I think there's this sense that we have sometimes that, you know, if it's in the original, it can't be touched. And I don't think that's true. I think that's kind of a holdover from the sort of classical music, you know, the classical training that we get a lot of the time. And I'm not saying you should, you know, go and rewrite Beethoven, but this is a different scenario. All right, so getting into show design, because this is where really the arranger can have the most impact, because, well, they can have the most impact when they're working as part of the team, when they're working with the director, when they're working with the choreographer, when you really understand how your arrangement fits into the show. That's when you can make your best contribution. So These are kind of the 5 main categories of show choir shows as I see them. You have your traditional show, which is basically your 5-song set. You've got an opener, you've got some kind of change of pace, you've got a ballad, you've got a costume change number, you've got a closer. That's kind of the default for a lot of groups. And then you have obviously the story shows, which can be super complex, and they're built around characters, and there's usually a lot of mashups involved, and maybe even some original music, and you're kind of almost into sort of a Broadway musical production to a certain extent. A theme show can pretty much take musically whatever form you want. A lot of times you can have a traditional show that's also a theme show, but I do think it's worth separating out into a different category because especially when you look at the lyrics, like there might be certain lyrics that tie back to the theme, and you want to make sure you understand where those are. So 1, you don't cut them, and 2, you can make sure that you're emphasizing important lines and sort of making sure everything in the chart is pointing back to that main theme. And sometimes the theme is super obvious, right? Like maybe the theme is, colors. And so, okay, every song is about red or blue or green or whatever. And you don't really have to work that hard to get the theme to come through. But, if the show is loving yourself, if that's the theme of the show, or if it's airplanes, right, then you don't want to like cut the lyrics of the song that have to do with airplanes. You want to, if anything, you want to bring those out more. You want to repeat it. You want to make moments out of that. So you have, and similar to a theme show, you have a message show, right? That's kind of girl power, or I can do anything, or overcoming difficulties, right? Like a lot of directors like to have some sort of teachable idea in their show that they can incorporate. And so again, knowing what that is important when you're arranging. I think that's fairly obvious, but just to say it out loud, you want to make sure that the message is in the forefront of all the arrangements you're doing. But also, a lot of the lines between different kinds of shows get blurred. So maybe you have a message show, but there's like a little bit of a story in there, right? And so you want to make sure that you're still supporting that with what you do. And then a review show, that's like, sometimes maybe I saw a show last year where all the music was Queen, or all the music was Elton John, right? And so you're picking a specific artist or a specific genre, and you're really drilling down on that. And so again, just knowing the reasons why the directors and the choreographers picked the songs that they picked, and making sure that you're arranging them in such a way that it's going to support what they're doing. So getting a little more into the nitty gritty, if you will, the opener, that's where you establish your first impression. So for me, that usually means trying to work in some sort of big vocal statement right off the bat. But you're also kind of setting a baseline for what to expect the rest of the show. So obviously you want some vocal moments, you want some dance breaks, you want to kind of throw everything you have at the judges to a certain extent. With the ballad, obviously that's the most musical and emotional point of the show. That's when you have the chance to really flex your choral muscles. And you've got to also, if you're thinking about the entertainment value, you have to sort of compensate for the fact that you're not dancing, right? So there's going to be more complicated music in the ballad than you would have in the rest of the show. So when you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I arrange this? Or even like, is that, half the battle is just picking the right song for the show function. Which it always makes me laugh, because people will buy things for my website, and sometimes they will buy like something that I've written as a closer, and they'll use it as like a song number 2, So obviously there's some songs that work in multiple situations. But in terms of your arranging process, like you always got to be thinking about where does it fit in the show. Like the closer, that's probably going to be the most dance heavy number of the show. That's going to be where you have the most visual moments, right? So you have to make sure the band is supporting that and giving opportunities for that. You want to make sure your dance breaks are killer. You want to make sure that you have a really convincing ending. A lot of times, you know, you'll see something and it just kind of stops. And that's never a good feeling. You always want to be building into a moment or something where you can really sort of put an exclamation point on the show. You know, and then you've got transition numbers. Obviously, those are like, you know, a costume change number, or maybe there's a set piece that needs to come on, or there's some sort of prop that needs to be brought in, right? So they're usually shorter, and there's usually sort of a practical reason why you're doing it. And so those don't always need to be as complicated. But again, it depends on the situation. And then what I have here down as a style number, that's not really a term that I've heard people use, but you know, there's some arrangements that are in a show just because you want to change a pace. You want to show off a certain style of dance or a certain vocal style that your students are really good at, right? And so again, knowing the reasons why you picked the song and bringing that out, but they typically are not as long as an opener or a closer. Once you've kind of made the point that you're trying to make, you can move on, you know? So a lot of times these, you know, transition numbers, these style numbers, they can be maybe 2 minutes, you know? A lot of times you don't even need to repeat sections, right? You can do an intro, verse, chorus, dance break, boom, be done, you know, depending on what it is and how long it is. And then feature number, that's something that you're writing because maybe you have a really amazing soloist, or you want to have a band moment, or maybe you have a really great guitar player. And so, you know, there's a specific goal or a specific reason why it's in the show, and you want to make sure that the arrangement is taking the most advantage of that as you can. Okay, so let's talk about next, just kind of getting things to sound the way you want. The main thing is you want your horns and your vocals to be isolated from one another, right? So if there's singing going on, you know, the horns should not be playing. Or if maybe there's a transition like into a dance break, you don't want the horns overlapping with the end of the vocal phrase, right? So just making sure there's a nice clean separation between the two. Now, does that mean your horns can never, ever, ever play at the same time as they're singing? No, but you want to make sure they're not competing. And that depends too on just like how big of a group you have. You know, if you have 4 horns, that's not going to be nearly as loud as 15, right? But a lot of arrangers fall into this trap because they hear it on the original recordings. You know, they hear the Broadway score where the orchestra is playing the whole time, and they just copy all of that into their show choir charts, and then it just sounds messy when you put it together on stage, because most of the time you're only going to have just one set of either hanging mics or floor mics, you know, and that's just going to pick up what it picks up, and so you're not going to have the control over the sound that you would have in those original recordings. The next biggest thing is just to keep your vocal ranges compressed. So you want to keep the tenor bass parts in the upper part of the staff, on top of the staff, you know, kind of around that middle C area. And then the soprano alto parts generally, you know, within the staff. Depending on how big the group is, you may have some high sopranos that can flip up and you can get some of those taller vocal moments, but you wouldn't generally want to have, for example, like a unison melody part that's on the top of the staff, because then your altos are going to be dying, right? So just considering not only the ranges of the vocals, but also the vocal placement, because you're going to get a different sound from a group singing in their head voice versus their chest voice, right? And so making sure you're kind of got that in the back of your mind. You know, you don't want them singing on their break if you don't have to, and that contributes a lot to the balance of the group, especially when they're mismatched. You know, like if you have the tenors way up high and then the altos super low, well, the tenors are going to blow them away, right? And that's just kind of, it's kind of this constant game you play, right? Especially when you're arranging pop music, because the ranges of some of these pop songs are all over the place. You know, you have an octave and a half, and so you kind of have to. It's always a challenge, but you know, if you're creative with how you split up the melody, you can get most of it in a good place, I think. Ending phrases up is another good way of keeping things balanced, because typically, you know, higher phrases are louder. So just thinking about the direction of the lines that you're writing. So like a lot of times when you're crescendoing, you're going to get a bigger crescendo if the line is also going up versus if it's going down, because naturally the line is just going to carry more that way. And then, yes, so then rhythms. Something that I've learned is that just in general, the faster a rhythm is, the harder it's going to be to play loud, right? So if, especially with the band, if you've got like a string of fast 16th notes, you know, it's going to be a lot harder to project on that than if it was just, you know, quarter notes. And the same is true for vocal writing too. So, you know, thinking about, okay, this is a really complex rhythm, so maybe I'm not going to have a ton, maybe I'm not going to have a ton of music on this. Or with, if it's supposed to be, you know, a soft dynamic, maybe then it's more effective. And then thinking about the vowels, right? And planning your DVC and planning those big chords and planning those moments around where the vowels are going to be, right? So if you've got a, you know, if you've got a big tall chord on an E vowel, you know, like you can do it, but you're going to get more power out of an ah or an o. So just thinking strategically with that can pay a lot of dividends, especially, again, like I said before, you don't want things to be hard just because. If there's a great reason, you know, if the theme of your show is, you know, me, then you're going to sing that word a lot, right? And there's no getting around that. But you know, being strategic with how you use the text of the song can go a long way. And the way I think of it, there's basically two ways to approach arranging. You have transformative arranging, which is when you're taking something and you're consciously trying to make it your own, make it different, make it new, make it creative. You know, you're going to do the postmodern jukebox thing where you're going to take it and put it in a different style. Versus transcriptive arranging, which is just, hey, we want to do this song from Hamilton. We like it the way it is. We're picking it because it is the way it is. We just want you to transcribe it and make it as close to the original as possible. That's a great way to kind of get your feet wet as a young arranger. You can pick a song that's already close to what you want. You know, a lot of these Broadway shows, you know, will have the sheet music online so that you already have a great piano part. You know, you've got, in some cases, you know, other instrumental parts that you can use, and pretty much all you have to do is make some cuts and harmonize the melody line, and boom, you're done. You've got an arrangement. But again, you have to think about, why did you pick the song? And so if the reason the director wants the song is because the original is amazing, then great. Or maybe it's a song that everybody knows, or it's a song that everybody's performed a whole bunch. And so you've got to make some conscious choices to make it different so that people aren't bored. You know, and this is where sometimes people can get into trouble, like using the stock charts, because those are not designed to be part of a 20-minute set. They're designed to be concert pieces. You know, you do the whole thing, you talk to the audience, you clap, you have a minute, then you go to the next song, right? So when you're singing, like, We Don't Talk About Bruno, you're buying that chart because you want to sing the whole song. But maybe in a show choir context, you only need 2 minutes of it, right? So you've got to make some cuts there. And when you make those cuts, and when you're making other sort of creative decisions and musical decisions, you've always got to be thinking about the form of the song. So most of the time things are in, you know, 4-bar, 8-bar phrases, but it would be weird to cut like 2 measures out of a chorus, right? So if you're going to do a cut, like, it's probably going to be the whole chorus or maybe half the chorus. Or when you're planning your dynamic phrases, you know, maybe the first chorus is going to be loud and then the second verse is going to be soft, and then you're going to build into a dance break, right? But just sort of mapping things out according to the song form, and just making sure each time we move from one section of the song to the next that something is different, you know, especially for the rhythm section. or especially the drums in particular. You know, it's like you want the groove to change a little bit and evolve as you're moving from one piece of the song to the next. And I said this before, but just to reiterate, you know, just because it's on the original recording doesn't mean it's going to sound good, right? A lot of these recordings, you know, pop recordings, for one thing, a lot of it is just synth instruments, which you're not going to have. Or maybe there's, you know, 12 layers of guitar and you've only got one. And so there's no way for you to exactly recreate everything that's there. So you've got to just pick and choose the pieces that are going to work best for what you have. So you've really got to communicate with directors and be confident in like, okay, well, what is your band? Like, what instruments are you reliably going to have? And you know, making the most of whatever situation that you're in. And this is something I've talked about before, but you know, every song basically has 4 elements. There's the melody, there's the chord structure of the song, you know, the bass line of the song. There's the groove, which is the rhythmic feel of the song and the rhythmic patterns. And then there's what I call the filler, all the extra stuff. So when you're analyzing one of these, you know, let's say you're arranging a great big orchestral Broadway number, right? And they've got a full orchestra and you've got, you know, piano, drums, 2 trombones and 2 trumpets, right? And so you're figuring out, well, how do I cover all this stuff? Well, you know, the choir is going to take the melody, of course. You know, the bass is going to take the bass line. You can outline the chords with the piano. That's, you know, that's easy enough. You know, and then you want to make sure that the important rhythmic patterns from the orchestra are in the rhythm section. And then the filler, you know, you want to fill the gaps. So if there's space in between vocal lines, that's a moment where you can insert some horns. But basically, you always want your audience to know what they're supposed to be paying attention to, right? You don't ever want them to be sitting there just kind of waiting for the next thing. So when a vocal phrase ends, boom, that's when the horns are going to take over. And then boom, it's going to be a dance break. But just make sure you have everything plotted out so you can go from one thing to the next. And I do think, you know, I'm probably overly sensitive to this just because I've done so much judging. And when you're judging, you're sitting there and you're watching literally, you know, 30 show choir sets back to back. And so it's easy to get bored. But, you know, if you can write a show or if you can write an arrangement that's going to keep a judge interested, you're certainly going to keep your audience interested. So while I don't think it's necessarily healthy to be like hyper focused on, well, what are the judges going to think? You know, I do think there is some value in that just because of the fact that like they've seen so much show choir, their attention spans are probably, you know, shorter maybe than your grandma, which is excited to see you from the first time, right? And so I don't think necessarily from your standpoint as an arranger, it's bad to think about that. And this is something that I say, you know, with all respect, but there's no subtlety in show choir, just because of the way it's set up and the way that it's mic'd, and you know, going back to the acoustics and the audience screaming, like there's little subtle details in the background of your synth 2 part, you know, are just not going to cut through. And so when you're painting, you've got to use big brushes and you need a lot of them, and you need to be constantly sort of changing the focus. So you know, variety and contrast are what I'm always thinking about and trying to focus on. So you don't ever want to repeat a section the same. You know, if the chorus comes back a second time, you've got to voice it differently or change the accompaniment or do something to make it interesting. Otherwise, like, what was the point of repeating? And I also think too, like a lot of times when I was starting out as an arranger, people, you know, composers would give me the advice that, you know, like it doesn't have to be hard to be good, right? You've heard that before. You don't need to put everything you've ever done into an arrangement, right? And that's, you know, they're right, but it's kind of a frustrating thing to hear when you're starting out, because it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, how do I know if it's too simple, right? And so I think the answer to that is kind of taking a step back, at least in the show choir context, and just thinking about like, what is an audience really going to notice? Like if there's 50 people on stage singing as loud as they can and the horns are going off, like, is anyone really going to notice like what the left hand of the piano is doing? I don't think so. Now if it's a soft, piano moment and it's maybe just a soloist and then the piano, and you can write some beautiful, complicated things there, right? But just thinking about just the overall context and how it's going to be received. And if you were sitting in the audience watching, like what would make an impact? And I'm like the worst offender of this because I am an overthinker, and I will just sit there and I will be like, well, should the second finger of the synth be doing this or this? Where it's like, I really just need to move on and put a basic pattern and not stress about it so much. But again, like changing something drastically is going to get noticed, right? So if you go from a piano dynamic to a triple forte dynamic, like that's going to be more noticeable than like the difference between a mezzo piano and a mezzo forte. Or if you're changing keys, right? Or if you're going from an a cappella section to a big band moment, like those are big contrasts. And the more of those you have, like the more interesting the chart's going to be. So when I'm arranging, I'm really trying to think about like, what are the moments? What are the memorable things in each song? And I literally have sticky notes all over my desk, like kind of writing down, like for this show, I want to do this, or for this song, I want to do this. I'm not going to show you because it's embarrassing because I'm a slob. But like when I'm arranging a full show, I will literally write down the songs and I will kind of map out where I'm going to do my like vocal tricks, right? Because I don't want to have, for example, an a cappella chorus out of the dance break happening in every song. So I'll kind of plan out, well, I can do an a cappella moment in this one. I can do a big like layered chord in this one. I can have a bunch of key changes in this one, and I will try to sort of spread out my tricks, if that makes sense, so that I'm not kind of putting everything in one song and then repeating myself a whole bunch. But some things you can do, there's the show choir inversion where you have a chord and then you shift it up. You have moments where you can drop the band out, like on a big important vocal line. Or maybe you're hitting a really cool chord and you just want to add an extra beat. Just make it a 5/4 measure just so they can hold it a little longer and then hit the next thing. Accenting important words with a chord, layering things, key changes, changing up the voicing, rather than having the whole chorus unison and the whole verse in parts. Maybe you're splitting up within the chorus, like you're going to have 2 bars unison, then 2 bars chords, and then you're going to have a back and forth thing between the tenors and the altos or whatever. But just doing as much as you can to keep the ear interested. And like we mentioned with the filler stuff, anytime there's empty space in the original, like that's an opportunity for you to put something. So if there's a 1-bar turnaround, in the middle of the verse, like that's a moment where the band can have a that's a moment where the band can step in, do something cool, and then like go back to being in the background. And again, like I will say this till I'm blue in the face, but there's no point of repeating anything unless you're going to be different about it. It doesn't have to be a huge difference, right? You don't have to completely like change the feel of the song, but just like the copy paste thing gets really old when you're sitting there watching a 25-minute show. And so again, we talked about why are you doing this song, but you can also break that down to like, okay, in this section, like why am I doing verse 2? Is it because the lyrics are important? Is it because I've got a new vocal thing I want to try? Or do we not really need it? Can we just cut it and go on to the next thing, and for the overall purposes of the show, be fine? So what I do when I'm arranging a song, first thing I do is I listen to as many different versions of it as I can. I look to see if there's sheet music. I look to see if there's MIDI files I can use. I look to see if there's remixes. I look to see if the live version is different than the recorded version. I look on YouTube and Spotify and so on to see if there have been covers of the song. Sometimes that will give me an idea or an inspiration for a way to approach the song. But you kind of have to know like what's been done before so you can make choices about how you want to do it. I will even look for other show choirs. I don't usually listen to other show choir arrangers versions because I don't want to copy them. But I do sometimes look at other groups to see, oh, well, if somebody else has done this song, then maybe I'm going to pick a different song, right? So once I've done that, I just kind of map out the overall structure of the song. I figure out the cuts, and I figure out kind of where the moments are going to be. So maybe, first verse solo, second verse choir, chorus, dance break, chorus. Maybe that's my structure, right? And I'm going to, put a key change here or a vocal thing here. And I'm not one of those people that has everything, fully formed and notated and outlined and diagrammed, and color coded before they start. I'm very much the type of person that has to like write the arrangement poorly, step away from a couple of days, then come back and tweak it a little more, and then like do something else, and then come back and tweak it a little more, right? But I do find that it's helpful to have at least a basic idea of what I want to do before I start. If nothing else, so I don't waste time transcribing stuff I'm not going to use, right? Because that's really the time consuming part, is whether or not it's sheet music that you're copying or a recording that you're transcribing, like you have to figure out some way to get the original into your notation software so you can start messing with it. Once that's in there, though, that's, the next step is figuring out, okay, well, like what key is this going to be in, and how am I going to voice things, and where do I need to put it so it sits in a good place? And so at that point, I guess I'm just writing the vocals. And then once that's done, that's when I really start to dig into the band stuff. What's the accompaniment going to feel like? What are the dance breaks going to be? I will play it over and over again and just kind of get a sense for the feel of it. Sometimes I'll even conduct it like to my computer, just because I'm a nerd and I need to like pretend that I'm really doing it, and how would it feel like if I was in a performance setting, right? But because I kind of think if I can listen to it over and over and over again and still like it, that's a pretty good sign that maybe other people will too. So, and everyone's different, and I don't think there's anything wrong if you arrange and your process is a different, if you go about it a different way than mine. But I do think just like having a pattern that you can follow is helpful. And then there are some more resources if you wanted to take a deep dive. breezetunes.com has the show choir webinars we did during the season, where I interview directors and choreographers, and we talk about different subjects. And then there's also links to some magazine articles I've written for Productions magazine that has different topics. There's a lot of stuff about like working with show choir bands, holiday music, that sort of thing. And then not specific to show choir, but on GARRETT'S.com, there are some blog articles and some resources just for arranging in general. If you are interested, or if you're arranging for things other than show choir, some of that might be useful to you. So